absolutely normal that after an election, everybody has a kind of a big exhale. There are local elections coming up quickly. So that's the next opportunity to test run these recommendations and actually try to implement them. The conditions are, of course, very different now than they were before the elections. Electoral participation of national minorities, but also with a specific, a study and investigation on the participation of women.
Bangladesh's electoral process has long been under scrutiny, with growing concerns over transparency, participation, and public trust. As questions around credibility and inclusiveness continue to shape political discourse, efforts are underway to strengthen democratic processes and restore confidence among voters. One such initiative is Ahead Bangladesh, an EU-funded project working to support citizen election observation, civic engagement, and inclusive political participation. But how effective are these efforts on the ground? Can they truly make elections more credible and more trusted? To discuss this, I'm joined by Michael Lidor, Senior International Advisor for Ahead Bangladesh. So, Michael, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Our studio. We just recently finished our very much anticipated and what we have been long waiting for, the national parliamentary elections, the 13 national parliamentary elections. So I believe your project, your team was on the ground, and now that the election is over, what recommendations do you have, and how do you think the recommendations will be? How much will be they implemented?
All right. So that's already a very detailed question regarding our project. The recommendations is really one of the key elements of what observers leave behind, one of their legacy, but also the substance of material they work with after an election. Yeah, but allow me to take it a step back and explain the origins of the project. So with our project Ahead Bangladesh, implemented by the European Partnership for Democracy with support of the European Union delegation in Bangladesh, we have been working to support citizen election observers ahead of these elections since last August. And let me remind that citizen election observation, like national Bangladeshis going out to observe their elections nationally, is nothing really new in this country. On the contrary, there's a great history with it. Like thousands of national election observers have been deployed in the mid-1990s, in 2000, and last in 2008. Yeah, so Bangladesh has really a long-standing history with this. But during the 15 years prior to the July uprising, there was little of such practices. And so there was really a revisit of these past practices, while the methodologies in this area have internationally evolved and things are not exactly done the way they were done 15 years ago, including the use of modern technologies. So in our process, we have looked at, first of all, the interest, on the side of particular civil society organizations to engage in this process. Yeah, the regulatory framework that is provided by the Bangladesh Election Commission for domestic and international election observers, and then to partner with organizations, not only one, several organizations in this field, to develop specific methodologies towards the deployment of election observers around election day. So observations start before, they peak on election day, and they continue afterwards. And then come the recommendations. And with the recommendations, we will continue to work from here. And of course, I can see more about that.
In Bangladesh, crisis of public trust, that is a major issue. Yeah. So how do you assess the current situation?
Okay, the current situation, I think it's still a little bit early to assess the new situation under the new government. I think we have to give some more time to assess how the current situation looks like, also how civic space develops in this context, what will be the political gameplay, what will be the space for civil society organizations to operate in this space, what will be their freedom of expression, what will be their capacity and space to advocate for changes and continue the reform drive that has prevailed, prior to the elections. But I think what we can say already, the conditions are of course very different now than they were before the elections. Our project has started at a time when the reform drive was at its peak, and when the transitional interim government was providing the rules for the game. Now voters have chosen a new government, the new government is in place, and now how the situation unfolds from here, it yet has to be further seen and observed.
So, about your project,
yes,
how far has it reached in terms of including the rural or marginalized observers?
All right. So let me explain you a little bit the way how our project was structured. We had one partner organization, for example, the Jago Foundation, who was focusing specifically on civic and voter education for women and youth. And they have reached very far, as you say, at the community level, with organizing community action projects in every single electoral constituency and to do outreach for first-time voters at that level. So that was deep. And with the citizen election observer work that we have been doing with EPD, this was also a rather broad portfolio. We have not partnered with only one organization or network, but with 4 or 5 different organizations in this area. So we have the Alliance for Fair Elections and Democracy, AFID, as a networking partner. This network has up to 30 different members across the country and has reached across the country with statistically based samples of where more observers, where less observers should be in urban areas as well as in rural areas. So very good broad distribution, and there were around up to 3,000 observers deployed from that angle alone. But then we also had other partner organizations that, for example, focused on the electoral participation of persons with disabilities, the electoral participation of national minorities, but also with a specific, a study and investigation on the participation of women. So we looked at particular stakeholder groups, and those partners who engaged with national minorities particularly, they have gone to very far-flung places, among others, together with urban contexts and constituencies, but they have gone to very far-flung places to actually reach voters, who are not normally tied into the usual urban civil society networks of this country, but they've really gone far out to reach people and engage with people who normally don't get the chance to do that.
What do you think? Can citizen observers really make a difference in places where the political environment is very contested?
Oh yes, definitely. Citizen observers make a difference. That's why citizens want them. That's why civil society organizations propose them. That's why they, ask for support for exercises like this. But they fulfill different functions and roles at different moments in time. At the most visible, this is of course on election day. Yeah, on election day, if you have visible, independent, neutral observers at the opening of the polling station, during the voting process, at the closing, during the counting process, during the tabulation of results, it makes a difference. It sends a signal to electoral officials that somebody is watching. It shows a signal to different sides of the political spectrum that there is a neutral force watching. So just the signaling and effect by its presence is already important. Yeah, this signaling effect also has an impact in the larger electoral environment. Before this election, based on historical experiences, there was quite some anticipation of the risk of electoral violence. So if you know from the outset that there will be election observers, that risk is getting a little bit lower because somebody is watching. So that's another aspect that is important also to bear in mind for the next local elections, right? But then there is, of course, relating to your previous question, also a future effect from their presence, because the impact of election observers does not stop on election day. It's lasting because they leave behind recommendations based on their systematic methodological collection of findings. They prepare recommendations on the basis of international standards and good international practices, and provide these recommendations to the Election Commission and other national stakeholders, and so they can work with that in the future. And practices that deserve improvement, maybe are already good, can become even better in the future.
So are we in the follow-up period right now?
The follow-up period is starting. Yeah, I think it's absolutely normal that after an election everybody has a kind of a big exhale, as we have seen during the month of Ramadan. But now I think we have just seen a kickoff for the follow-up today. Today we have seen the press conference of the EU election observation mission, the international mission return visit. They have presented their final report with 19 recommendations today, just a few hours ago. Yeah, with their 19 recommendations, 6 priority recommendations to the public. During the previous days, this report was already presented to the Bangladesh Election Commission and national authorities. Now, during the next couple of days, this mission will also have roundtable discussions with national political and civil society stakeholders to make these recommendations more widely known and get feedback on it. But after that, this mission will close and will leave. And exactly this point marks what you call the follow-up. It marks the kickoff for the follow-up period. And this is where projects like ours come into play. Like our project, as we mentioned, has started already last year in August, but it's running until the end of this year, beginning next year. And now we can work with the international election observer recommendations that are left behind, but we also consolidate the national election observer organizations' recommendations. Like we have 5 partners who have produced recommendations. But overall, there were 81 organizations accredited to actually observe these elections. We are currently assisting the Election Commission to go through this body of recommendations, to structure them in a coherent manner on the topical areas, priority areas, how changes can be addressed through legislative changes, through administrative action, procedural changes by the Commission alone, and so forth. So in this follow-up process, first of all, you look at the recommendations, you try to cluster them, and then there will be a prioritization process where the Election Commission, political stakeholders will say, this is how we want to prioritize, and these should be the next steps to implement these recommendations, to some extent in continuation of a previous reform drive, to some extent maybe new aspects. We cannot forget that there was an Electoral Reform Commission who also had left, a number of recommendations. Now is the time to look at this all together and work together, between national stakeholders and international partners to actually help implement these recommendations.
These are crucial information for Bangladeshi audience actually, and since you have experience, you must have seen the most successful election reforms and the most unsuccessful election reforms. I believe you have traveled through across South Asia. So what do you think, what lessons can Bangladesh draw? Or you were talking about the process, the roundtables and advocacy, and then prioritizing, and then you mentioned certain phases in how these recommendations will be implemented. But do you sense any kind of impediment or any issue, or would you like to flag out any issue that may slow the process or hinder the process? And also the second question is, what lesson Bangladesh can draw, since you have been experiencing these election reforms for a very long time,
Right.
and in this region particularly?
Yeah. So, how to start? So, first of all, it depends a little bit on the type of recommendation. Yeah, some are very easily implementable. There are low-hanging fruits. There are procedural practices that can be changed. Others may be very, touching upon structurally embedded societal phenomena regarding women participation in Bangladesh, for example, where you know that conditions for women participation, when we just come from this election and seen how few candidates we had, these conditions will not change very quickly. Yeah, so anybody who wants to work with these recommendations has to have a long breath and be in there in the long haul with a long-term interest. Yeah, and other topics that may have not been looked much in advance and are maybe new, they deserve fresh attention. Regulation of digital social media, for example, is globally an area of new challenges that we all have to think through together, how best to do this in the electoral process. Or a topic like campaign finance, it ultimately requires political will, to exercise regulation in this area. But what are good lessons learned on how to do this best? One lesson learned is to start early. Now is the time to think about these things, because the memory of the electoral process is still fresh, right? It's not long ago, but in 2-3 years from now, these recommendations, some of them may appear a bit distant because the experience is longer away and we don't know how the political process will unfold. So as long as the memory is fresh, we want to use this as an opportunity and work with it. And then quick implementation when there is an opportunity. So there are local elections coming up quickly. So that's the next opportunity to test run these recommendations and actually try to implement them. Not in 5 years, but there are elections around the corner at various levels over the coming year or so, where we can already work towards their implementation. And lastly, continued stakeholder engagement. We know from many countries, including in this region, that when national authorities like the Election Commission partner with civil society organizations and don't look at them as an enemy or an overcritical force, but as a constructive force that can provide external scrutiny and provide external insights, then this can be a very meaningful process to actually develop many aspects of the election further. And same can be said about the international community. International supporters, international development partners also sometimes forget that electoral reforms have to be pursued with a long breath. Yeah, everybody is interested in electoral reforms just before and just after an election, but we all need, long-term attention to these matters, because the legislative and the administrative changes, they're not made during the election. They are made in the cycle in between. And this is also where we have to focus. And lastly, the connection to the legislator. Ultimately, fundamental changes concern often the legal framework. So if changes are not undertaken in Parliament, some of these things will not change. So good relationships with representatives inside Parliament are critical in this space.
One question is, EU EOM, the report you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So they recommend revising inconsistencies and loopholes in the legal framework. So what do you think the top priorities that should be changed?
Well, there could be a couple of areas that can be mentioned, that the international colleagues are referring to in this area, with a view to citizen election observers, I can see it would be relatively simple to change a few criteria in this space. I think before our show recording has started, I've mentioned that the Bangladesh Election Commission was, very much responsive to advocacy for changing in this space, and the required age for national election observers was lowered from 25 to 21 to allow for enhanced youth participation. So that was a very good sign. Another area where we are still thinking there could be room for improvement, is, for example, the area where citizen election observers cannot observe in their home constituencies. This has a detrimental effect. You allow observers to observe somewhere else, which is good, more scrutiny, but by default, you don't allow them to vote in their home constituency. And things like this can be easily addressed by changing some rules. Another area where changes can be changed, where improvements can be made, is the area of postal voting. I think this was really interesting to see at this time how this played out. It was for the first time that the Bangladesh Election Commission, in the reform drive under the interim government, has chosen to implement postal voting. And to be
it was very much talked about.
It was very much talked about. And to be quite honest, a few months before the elections, we thought this is very risky. We thought that this is politically totally understandable why this is being pursued, to bring on board, the important, huge Bangladeshi diaspora and allow them to vote. But to implement this technically a few months before the election and bring people on board, it requires not only new administrative operations, technical procedures, but also huge information campaigns to actually make this possible and do it in a way that is valid and it is not creating unnecessary discomfort or problems that otherwise could be avoided. So, in a nutshell, it was done very well. And we can see that people have accepted it. It could be implemented, both postal voting inside the country and from outside the country. But of course, this practice can grow in the future. Many more people can be aware of it. Many more people can participate in it, but they can also do it better. For example, there was a comparatively high number of invalid votes because people put their signature on the envelope in the wrong place, and they unintentionally invalidate the ballot. With better information campaigns, things like this can be avoided, and more people can participate. But also, the type of people who are eligible for this, can be extended. Now we have a good takeaway from this postal voting experience. We have heard a lot that the persons with disabilities still face, many barriers on election day. They have to be carried to upper floors. They cannot access buildings. They cannot hear or see what's going on. They don't have the type of assistance that they need. And they often don't find the understanding of the polling officer on the ground in this process. These are well-known problems. One of our observation partners, B-Scan, which focused specifically, on observing this particular thematic, has provided very concrete, very detailed recommendations of how to improve this. Provide polling stations that are accessible for persons with disabilities on the ground floor. Allow them public transport on election day because otherwise they cannot reach there. But also, why not extend postal voting to persons with disabilities so you avoid these problems from the outset? Enlarge the number of people who can make use of this technique, and that have more people participating in the fair election.
Thank you very much for this nuanced and very insightful conversation. It was lovely to have you. And thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much. Likewise, it was very nice talking to you, and thank you for your interest in our work.